Crimea, a beautiful peninsula in the Black Sea that few people in the West have heard about before 2014. And then, all hell broke loose. Russian occupation. Dun dun dun! Really? We're not doing the turn? Russian annexation. Dun dun dun! What else was there? Some of this, some of that. There was the land grab, the acting in the 21st century like you do in 19th century. There was even some of this. But what really happened here 2 years ago? Hello, and happy St. Patrick's Day. My name is Alex, and we're here in the Crimean city of Sevastopol. Tomorrow marks 2 years since Russia officially either annexed Crimea or Crimea rejoined Russia. We're here to find out the truth about what happened here back then, learn why it happened, and talk to local people and to see what they think about it. So, as you know from our previous videos, in the winter of 2013-2014, there was a movement called the Euromaidan in the Ukrainian capital city of Kiev, aimed at ousting President Viktor Yanukovych, the elected president. While there was significant support for the movement in western and central Ukraine, people in southern East Ukraine, especially in the regions of Donbass and Crimea, were very wary of what was going on in Kiev. In February 2014, Euromaidan, which was supported by Ukraine's robber baron oligarchs and the West, came to a violent resolution. Hardcore ultranationalists, hiding behind the backs of peaceful protesters, organized a violent coup d'etat. During the Euromaidan, Russia and Russian speakers were often targets of hateful calls and speeches, and Crimea, where the wrong kind of Ukrainians live, and where 90% of people speak Russian, was a favorite target of nationalists. Immediately after the Euromaidan overthrew Yanukovych, the first act of the new revolutionary parliament was to repeal a law that gave language rights to Russian and other minority language speakers. Crimea was once again on top of that list. Even before this, before Euromaidan even won, on the 20th of February of 2014, near the city of Korsun, ultranationalists stopped a bus full of Crimeans who were in Kiev to voice their opposition to the Euromaidan movement. These activists were taken out of the bus, humiliated and beaten. 7 people died on that day, and the nationalists themselves posted videos of this on YouTube, bragging about their victory and threatening to do the same to anyone who disagreed with their vision of what Ukraine should be. They also publicly promised to send a, quote, friendship train full of armed thugs to Crimea to force the locals to love Ukraine, or else. So blood, Crimean blood, was spilled by Ukrainian nationalists, the victors of Euromaidan. And in the cold of late February of 2014, 7 Crimean families were burying their fathers and sons, and all 2 million Crimeans were preparing for the worst. But why were there so many raw Ukrainians in Crimea? To answer that question, we have to look back at the history of Crimea. Crimea is a strategic peninsula located in the northern part of the Black Sea. Because of this, Crimea has been part of various empires and kingdoms. Roman, Greek, Byzantine, Ottoman, and even Mongol empires at various points claimed all or some of the peninsula. Traders from as far as Italian Venice and Genoa established trade colonies here. The ancient Russian Tmutarakань Principality, founded in the 10th century, laid claim to the eastern part of the peninsula. Ancient tribes like the Tatari and the Scythians, as well as modern Crimean Tatars, had their power base on the peninsula. Hell, even the Goth, the ones who sacked Rome, not the ones who wear all black, called Crimea their home in the past. For centuries, Crimea was a launching ground for slaver raids into southern Russian lands. But in 1783, Catherine the Great of Russia, after defeating Turkey in a decade-long war, incorporated the peninsula into the Russian Empire. In early 19th century, Crimea, together with what would later become southern East Ukraine, was part of the Novorossiya, or New Russia region of the Russian Empire. Under Russian rule, Crimea was settled by Russians, Belarusians, Little Russians, as Proto-Ukrainians were called back then, as well as Germans, Bulgarians, Jews, and many others. The region experienced growth in trade, agriculture, and later tourism, and flourished under the Russian rule. Even after the creation of the Ukrainian state by Vladimir Lenin, and after Ukraine was one of the founding members of the Soviet Union, Crimea remained part of the Russian Federal Republic within the USSR. Take a look at this clip from US Department of Defense, Why We Fight film.
Germany saved Russia from losing the Ukraine and the Crimea.
Ukraine and Crimea are clearly and obviously separate entities. And it was the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, who unilaterally, and many say in violation of Soviet law, transferred Crimea from Russian Soviet Republic to Ukrainian Soviet Republic. But again, at this time, no one imagined the Soviet Union would ever collapse. So the transfer was just an administrative and a technical decision within one country. But at its core, in its soul, Crimea always remained Russian. Furthermore, Russian Christian tradition originates in Crimea. Russian Prince Vladimir, who baptized the Russian people, was himself baptized in the town of Khersones in Crimea, and Sevastopol is the Russian equivalent of American Alamo, a city that on two occasions, during the Crimean War of the 19th century and World War II, heroically held its ground, didn't surrender, and fought the enemy to the last defender. These are some of the historic reasons Russia believes it has a valid claim to Crimea. But you know, Russia's claim that Crimea is Russian, because of some ancient prince, or even because of what happened here in World War II, is not that relevant. What really matters, at least if we live in a democratic society, is what the Crimeans of today think and want.
Душевное спокойствие, что мы находимся в безопасности, нам ничто не угрожает.
Я считаю, исторически Крым всегда был российским, поэтому я думаю, он вернулся туда, где ему место, так что все нормально.
У нас хорошее настроение.
Здравствуйте.
Да вы знаете, я, в общем-то, жила и до того, когда он был украинский, и на Украине, и сейчас. И я считаю, что как может быть оккупация. У нас появилась возможность вернуться на родину, мы и вернулись. И чувствуем себя от этого благороднее.
В Севастополе всегда все себя россиянами ощущали, по-моему. Не было никогда чувства, что да.
Вы понимаете, что мы все равно действительно, вот 23 года жили с Украиной, но мы все равно это был как русский уголочек. И всегда ощущали себя русскими. Никуда не денешь наши традиции, наши корни. Вот столько исторических памятников, столько всего русского, что уже... Ну, в принципе-то, вот я, как я считаю, мое мнение, что украинцы, что русские, у нас одни корни.
So, in 2014, after Ukrainian nationalists killed 7 Crimeans and threatened to do the same to anyone who disagrees with the new democratic government in Kiev, locals started to organize into self-defense units and scheduled a referendum to democratically decide the future of their region. However, this was not the first time this happened. In January of 1991, when leaders in still Soviet Kiev were talking about declaring independence from the Soviet Union, Crimea held a referendum, the first ever referendum held in the Soviet Union. The referendum asked the question if Crimeans want to stay under Kiev's control or want to restore the pre-Khrushchev arrangement when Crimea was administered from Moscow. 1,441,000 people, or 81.3% of Crimeans, came out to vote, and 93.26% of them voted in favor of Moscow. In May 1992, when Ukraine already seceded from the Soviet Union, Crimean parliament declared national sovereignty of Crimea and scheduled a referendum on that matter to be held in August. But the government in Kiev forced them to abandon the initiative. Back then, too, armed nationalists sent a, quote, friendship train in order to scare the Crimeans into abandoning their hopes and dreams. In March of 1995, the central government of Ukraine unilaterally annulled the Crimean constitution. The local government again scheduled a referendum to uphold the old constitution, but again, under the pressure from nationalists and Kiev government, was forced to back down. And finally, in 2006, Crimeans held an unrecognized referendum about Ukraine joining NATO. 98.7% of the 900,000 people who showed up voted against it. So, once again, you see, Crimeans have for decades tried to guarantee their basic national rights through democratic referendums. And for decades, Ukraine strong-armed them against it. So when the thugs, which has publicly killed 7 Crimeans, came to power in Kiev, people here knew that they could no longer count on the Ukrainian state to fulfill its primary function, to protect them. And they started to organize into self-defense units. And once it was obvious that the state was not only not going to protect them from murderous nationalists, but that some of those murderous nationalists became the state itself, it was time for another referendum. This one, to once and for all, democratically decide the future of the region. And on the 16th of March of 2014, over 80% of Crimeans who came out to the polls voted for the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol to rejoin their ancestral homeland and become part of the Russian Federation. And Russia, that evil empire, dared to do the most despotic thing ever, to recognize a free and democratic referendum. Now, Ukraine and the West often blame Russia of having neo-imperialist goals. But what is an empire in essence? An empire is when a state values territory more than the dreams and desires of people who live in those territories. Empire is saying, I don't care what 2 million people have democratically chosen. All I care about is this land. Isn't that an attempted land grab? A land grab from right under the people who live on this land and who have lived here for generations. Now, let's do a quick mental experiment. Just for a minute, try to forget everything you know about evil Russia and good Ukraine. Forget even everything I told you today, and just focus on the question. There's a country A that doesn't allow people of a certain region to hold referendums, doesn't recognize these referendums when they're democratically held, doesn't want to give language rights to people who have spoken their language on their land for centuries, has a government that doesn't punish thugs for killing wrong kind of people, values territory over the living and breathing human beings who live there. Then there's country B, that defends organizers of a democratic referendum from thugs who prove they're willing to kill those who disagree with them, recognizes the democratic and peaceful desires of an overwhelming majority of people, values the hopes, dreams, and lives of people, not viewing them as just squatters on a desired territory. Now, please answer the question. Which one of these countries is a democracy, and which one of them is an empire? The obvious answer is country A exhibits all the worst traits of imperial thinking. And if you really did forget everything, you can now remember it back and unexpectedly realize that country B, that upheld the basic democratic rights of people, is a supposedly evil Russia, while country A, that values territory over people who live there, is a supposedly good Ukraine. So, if Western press and politicians were honest in their labels, they would be talking about Ukrainian empire. There's another thing that empires do, by the way. They exploit territories. Here again, Russia completely doesn't fit the bill. So here's a quick look at the horrors of occupation. So, since Crimea reunited with Russia, local salaries and pensions grew by as much as 100%. Locals are now guaranteed free quality healthcare and free education anywhere in Russia, including world-famous Moscow and St. Petersburg universities. Hospitals that were neglected for decades under Ukrainian rule are now receiving modern equipment, and doctors are getting higher pay. Furthermore, Russia is heavily investing in local infrastructure, building new power plants, roads, bridges, ports, and airports. The goal is to build up local businesses and infrastructure and to create better living conditions for all the locals here. That doesn't sound like occupation at all, does it? Thank you for watching. We hope this video helped you better understand what happened in Crimea 2 years ago and what is going on here now. So when we first came here, we just thought we would do one episode. But there's so much information that we found out here that we're going to do 2 more. The next one will cover the reason why Russian troops ended up being here, and we'll talk about the famous Budapest Memorandum that Russia supposedly broke. And in our 3rd video, we will cover the Crimean Tatars, the people that Russia supposedly oppresses and who want to break free. So for those videos and for many more from Crimea, Donbass, other parts of Ukraine, and videos with an analysis of what's going on, please sign up for our channel. Please comment, like, and of course please share.